There are roads that people avoid because they are narrow, others because they are dangerous, and then there are roads people avoid because of the stories. Across the windswept landscape of Dartmoor in southwest England, one stretch of road has inspired more than a century of whispered warnings. Drivers have described losing control of their vehicles without explanation. Cyclists have reported an unseen force pulling at their handlebars. One modern witness claimed that enormous hairy hands suddenly appeared on his steering wheel, trying to force his car off the road. Decades earlier, a woman sleeping in a caravan nearby reported seeing a giant hand reaching toward her window in the middle of the night. None of these accounts have ever been scientifically verified, yet they continue to be told, investigated, and debated long after the people who first reported them are gone. So why has this lonely road become one of Britain's most enduring paranormal legends? To understand that, we first have to understand the place itself. Dartmoor National Park covers nearly 1,000 square kilometers of rugged moorland in Devon, England. It is a landscape unlike almost anywhere else in Britain. Ancient granite tors rise above sweeping fields of heather. Thick mist can roll across the hills with remarkable speed, turning familiar landmarks into vague silhouettes within minutes. Streams weave through valleys that have changed little in centuries, while isolated farms and scattered villages remind visitors how remote parts of the moor still feel today. Despite its beauty, Dartmoor has always carried an air of mystery. Long before modern roads crossed the landscape, local communities filled these hills with stories of strange lights, phantom animals, hidden spirits, and unexplained encounters. Archaeological remains dating back thousands of years only added to the atmosphere. Stone circles, burial cairns, and prehistoric settlements quietly occupy the moor, reminding visitors that people have lived and imagined here for millennia. It is easy to understand why folklore flourished in such an environment. Fog alters perception, distance becomes difficult to judge, familiar sounds echo strangely across open ground. At night the silence can feel almost complete, interrupted only by the wind moving across the grass or rain striking ancient stone. For generations, local legends became part of everyday life. Among the most famous is the story of the hairy hands. Unlike many ghost stories that center on abandoned houses or forgotten castles, this legend focuses on movement. The reports almost always involve travelers, people driving alone, cyclists crossing the moor, motorcyclists navigating quiet roads. They describe an unexpected sensation that begins without warning, often while passing through the area near Post Bridge along the B32-1. According to these accounts, something unseen interferes with the journey. The details vary from witness to witness. Some describe only an overwhelming feeling that they are no longer fully in control of their vehicle. Others claim they briefly saw two unusually large, hairy hands reaching toward the steering wheel or handlebars. In nearly every version of the story, the experience lasts only moments before disappearing as suddenly as it began. Whether these reports share a common cause remains unknown. What is documented is that stories connected to this road began attracting wider attention during the early 20th century. One of the earliest frequently referenced historical incidents occurred in June 1921, when a doctor named Dr. Helby was involved in a fatal motorcycle accident near the area now associated with the legend. Contemporary reports attributed the accident to mechanical failure. There was no official conclusion suggesting paranormal involvement. However, the location of the accident soon became linked with existing local folklore. As similar stories spread from traveler to traveler, individual experiences gradually merged into a larger legend. This process is not unusual. Folklore scholars have long observed that legends often grow through repetition rather than invention. One unusual story encourages another person to share a similar experience. Local newspapers repeat the accounts. Visitors arrive already aware of the legend, making every unexplained event seem more meaningful. Over time, a place becomes inseparable from the stories attached to it. Dartmoor provides fertile ground for exactly this kind of cultural evolution. Its unpredictable weather plays a significant role. Meteorologists note that conditions on open moorland can change rapidly. Moist air moving inland from the Atlantic frequently produces thick fog, particularly during cooler parts of the year. Reduced visibility affects both depth perception and reaction time, Drivers may suddenly encounter sharp bends, grazing livestock, or patches of wet road that appear only at the last moment. Psychologists add another layer to this discussion. Expectation influences perception more than many people realize. When individuals enter an environment already associated with unusual stories, they naturally become more alert. Ordinary sensations, a shadow crossing the road, an unexpected movement of the steering wheel caused by uneven pavement, or a brief loss of concentration, may be interpreted differently than they would elsewhere. None of this proves or disproves the legend. Instead, it demonstrates how complex human perception can become under uncertain conditions. Still, one question refuses to disappear. Why do many of the accounts, separated by decades, describe surprisingly similar details? Was it coincidence, shared storytelling, the power of suggestion, or something that witnesses sincerely believed they experienced? These questions transformed the hairy hands from a local curiosity into one of Britain's best-known roadside mysteries. Then in 2008, a driver named Michael Anthony claimed to experience something that brought the legend back into the public eye. Unlike the stories passed quietly through local communities decades earlier, his account spread rapidly through newspapers, television, and the internet. It introduced the hairy hands to a new generation while raising the same difficult question that had echoed across Dartmoor for nearly a century. What, if anything, had happened on that lonely stretch of road? By the summer of 2008, the legend of the hairy hands had already survived nearly a century. Most people who traveled across Dartmoor had never experienced anything unusual. They saw rolling hills, granite outcrops, and quiet country roads stretching through one of England's most beautiful national parks. For many, the stories belonged to local folklore, interesting, unsettling, but ultimately just stories. Then one driver's account reignited the mystery. According to reports published after the incident, Michael Anthony was driving alone across Dartmoor during the evening. His route took him along the B32-112, the same stretch of road that had appeared repeatedly in older local legends. The weather was calm enough to continue driving, although, like many evenings on the moor, visibility shifted as patches of mist drifted across the landscape. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The road wound through open countryside, bordered by low stone walls and wide expanses of grassland. There were few other vehicles, no nearby villages, just the quiet rhythm familiar to anyone who has driven across a remote landscape after sunset. Anthony later recalled that the first sign something was wrong was not something he saw. It was something he felt. According to his account, both of his hands suddenly became numb while gripping the steering wheel. It was an unexpected sensation, one he later described as arriving almost instantly. Assuming it might simply be temporary discomfort or poor circulation, he adjusted his grip and continued driving. The feeling did not disappear. Instead, he said it intensified. Then came the moment that transformed an ordinary drive into one of the most widely discussed modern chapters of the hairy hands legend. Anthony claimed that a pair of enormous, dark, hairy hands appeared on top of his own hands on the steering wheel. He described them as animal-like rather than human, covered in coarse hair and noticeably larger than his own. According to his recollection, the hands seemed to pull the steering wheel sharply toward the edge of the road. It is important to emphasize that this description comes entirely from Anthony's personal testimony. No physical evidence was recovered, and no independent witness was present to confirm what he reported seeing. Nevertheless, his account attracted widespread attention because of one striking detail. It closely resembled stories that had circulated on Dartmoor for generations. Anthony later said he fought to keep control of the vehicle as it drifted toward the roadside. He remembered gripping the wheel with all his strength while trying to understand what was happening. Every instinct told him to correct the steering, yet he claimed the unseen force resisted. The struggle, according to his account, lasted only seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Anthony reported seeing a brief flash of light outside the vehicle. Almost immediately afterward, he noticed a strong smell that he described as sulfur. When he looked again, the strange hands were gone. The car remained on the road. He was physically unharmed, but he later explained that he sat inside the vehicle for several minutes before feeling able to continue driving. Stories involving unusual sensory experiences often present investigators with significant challenges. Unlike physical evidence, personal perception cannot be examined directly. Researchers must rely on interviews, consistency of testimony, and surrounding circumstances rather than measurable proof. Psychologists who study unusual experiences point out that human perception is remarkably complex. During periods of stress, fatigue, or heightened attention, the brain constantly interprets incomplete information from the surrounding environment. Under certain conditions, visual and tactile sensations may be experienced differently than expected. Importantly, this does not automatically imply that a witness is dishonest. People can sincerely report experiences exactly as they remember them, even when those experiences cannot be independently verified. This distinction is central to understanding the hairy hands legend. The question is not whether Michael Anthony believed what he experienced. By all available accounts, he did. The question is whether there is a natural explanation that could account for his experience. Several possibilities have been discussed. Driving on isolated roads at night demands sustained concentration. Even brief moments of fatigue can alter perception. Sudden changes in lighting, reflections from the windshield, and shifting patches of fog may influence how the brain interprets visual information. There is also the physical environment itself. The B-32-112 passes through exposed moorland where strong crosswinds can occasionally affect vehicle handling, particularly on open stretches of road. Uneven surfaces or unexpected steering corrections can produce sensations that feel far more dramatic when a driver is already startled. None of these explanations fully accounts for every detail Anthony described. At the same time, none of the reported details provide objective evidence for a supernatural cause. This balance between testimony and evidence explains why the case continues to be discussed. It occupies a space where certainty remains elusive. Another reason Anthony's account gained attention was its similarity to much older reports. Although separated by decades, several earlier witnesses had also described large hands interfering with steering or control. Whether these similarities reflect a shared cultural story, unconscious influence from local folklore, or something else entirely remains open to interpretation. Folklore researchers often describe this phenomenon as narrative continuity. Once a legend becomes established, future experiences may naturally be interpreted through that existing framework. A sudden loss of control on an unfamiliar road may simply become a mechanical problem. On a road already famous for the hairy hands, the same event may acquire an entirely different meaning. That possibility neither confirms nor dismisses Anthony's experience. It simply reminds us that stories influence how people understand the world around them. Yet there was another account, far older and even stranger, that expanded the legend beyond the road itself. It did not involve a moving vehicle. It did not involve a steering wheel. Instead, it centered on a quiet night in 1924 when a woman staying in a caravan near Dartmoor claimed that something reached toward her window from the darkness. Unlike Michael Anthony's experience, this encounter took place while the witness was completely still, and it would become one of the most enduring stories ever associated with the legend of the hairy hands. By the time the summer of 1924 arrived, the hairy hands legend was already beginning to circulate across Dartmoor. Travelers exchanged stories in village inns. Farmers mentioned unusual experiences to neighbors. Cyclists spoke quietly about moments when they felt something interfere with their handlebars. Most of these reports were impossible to verify, yet the stories continued to spread across the isolated moor. Then came an account that differed from nearly every story before it. It did not take place on the road. It did not involve a moving vehicle, and according to the woman who reported it, whatever she encountered appeared to leave the roadside entirely. Historical retellings describe a woman spending the night in a caravan positioned roughly half a mile from the stretch of road most closely associated with the legend. The exact location varies slightly between different versions of the story, a reminder that many details have been passed down through newspapers, local publications, and oral tradition rather than preserved in official investigative records. Even so, the central account has remained remarkably consistent. The evening had been quiet. The moor settled into darkness as it often does after sunset. When the last traces of daylight disappear behind rolling hills and granite tors, far from nearby towns, artificial light was almost non-existent. The silence was broken only by the wind moving across the open landscape and the occasional sound of distant wildlife. Inside the caravan, the woman prepared to sleep. According to later retellings of her experience, she was awakened during the night by an uneasy feeling that something outside had disturbed the silence. At first she believed it might be an animal. Dartmoor is home to wild ponies, sheep, cattle, foxes, and numerous birds, any of which could produce unfamiliar sounds in the darkness. She listened. The sounds continued. Then, according to her account, she looked toward the caravan window. What happened next transformed an ordinary night into one of the most frequently repeated stories connected to the hairy hands legend. The witness later claimed she saw an enormous hand rising slowly outside the window. She described it as unusually large, dark in appearance, and covered with coarse hair. Rather than resembling a human hand exactly, she believed it looked almost animal-like, while still possessing recognizably human features. It appeared, she said, to move deliberately toward the glass. It is important to emphasize that this description comes entirely from the witness's own testimony. No photographs exist. No independent observer reported seeing the same event. Historians generally classify the incident as part of local folklore supported by an eyewitness account rather than a verified historical event. According to the story, the woman froze. For several moments she remained unable to decide whether she was witnessing something real or simply struggling to understand an unfamiliar shape outside in the darkness. Nighttime perception can be remarkably deceptive. Vision changes significantly in low light. The human brain begins relying more heavily on incomplete visual information, often filling missing details using prior expectations and surrounding context. Psychologists have long demonstrated that ambiguous shapes viewed in darkness are more likely to be interpreted as meaningful objects than they are during daylight. This phenomenon alone cannot explain what the woman believed she experienced. It does, however, illustrate why investigators approach nighttime eyewitness accounts with careful caution. The woman later reported that as the hand appeared to move closer, she instinctively began praying. According to her testimony, the hand immediately withdrew and disappeared back into the darkness. She remained inside the caravan until daylight. Only then, according to later reports, did she feel confident enough to leave. Whether every detail unfolded exactly as remembered can no longer be determined. What makes the account historically significant is not its verifiability, but its influence. Unlike earlier reports involving cyclists and motorists, this story suggested that the mysterious hands were not limited to the road itself. In local folklore, the legend expanded from a roadside hazard into something capable of appearing anywhere on the surrounding moor. That shift changed the way many people interpreted later reports. During the following decades, additional witnesses described unusual experiences throughout Dartmoor. Some claimed they felt an unseen force while driving. Others spoke of unexplained sensations while walking alone across isolated parts of the landscape. A few even described glimpsing large hands before they vanished almost instantly. Although these stories differed in important details, they shared recurring themes: isolation, darkness, sudden appearance, equally sudden disappearance. Folklore researchers find these patterns particularly interesting. Across many cultures, legends often develop recognizable motifs that repeat from generation to generation. The consistency of these themes does not necessarily verify the events themselves. Instead, it demonstrates how communities preserve and transmit stories over long periods. In the case of Dartmoor, the landscape itself may contribute to that process. The open moor is visually dramatic, but also psychologically unusual. Vast, empty spaces provide very few points of reference. Fog frequently reduces visibility. Sounds travel unpredictably across valleys and open ground. Even experienced walkers sometimes report feeling disoriented despite remaining on familiar paths. Environmental psychologists note that locations with these characteristics often encourage powerful emotional responses. People become more alert, small surprises feel larger, ordinary events become memorable. When combined with an existing local legend, these environmental conditions may influence how unusual experiences are interpreted and remembered. Still, one question remains difficult to answer. Why have accounts describing large, hairy hands continue to appear, at least occasionally, across more than a century? Is the similarity simply the natural evolution of a well-known legend? Does expectation shape perception more strongly than we realize? Or are witnesses describing sincere experiences that current science cannot fully explain? These questions have never been answered conclusively. What can be said with confidence is that the hairy hands of Dartmoor occupy a unique place in British folklore. They exist at the intersection of eyewitness testimony, local tradition, psychology, and one of England's most atmospheric landscapes. To move closer to understanding why this legend has endured for so long, it is necessary to step away from the stories themselves and examine what science, history, and the environment can tell us about the road, the moor, and the remarkable power of human perception. Every enduring mystery reaches a point where the available evidence ends and interpretation begins. The hairy hands of Dartmoor are no exception. More than a century has passed since the earliest accounts began circulating across the moor. Generations of travelers have crossed the same roads, walked the same hills, and listened to the same stories. Some dismissed them immediately. Others left convinced they had experienced something they could not explain. Yet, despite decades of discussion, one remarkable fact remains unchanged. No investigation has ever produced physical evidence confirming the existence of the hairy hands as an objective phenomenon. That distinction is essential. It does not mean that every witness invented their experience, nor does it prove that something supernatural occurred. Instead, it reminds us that eyewitness testimony and physical evidence are not the same thing. Both are valuable, but they answer different questions. Testimony tells us what a person sincerely believes they experienced. Physical evidence helps determine what can be independently verified. The hairy hands legend lives almost entirely within the first category. For historians, that makes it fascinating. For psychologists, it makes it deeply instructive. For local communities, it has become part of Dartmoor's cultural identity. Scientists who study perception often point to a simple reality that most people rarely consider. Human senses do not function like video cameras. Every second, the brain receives enormous amounts of incomplete information and rapidly constructs what we experience as reality. Usually that process works extraordinarily well. Occasionally, particularly under conditions of fatigue, stress, darkness, isolation, or uncertainty, perception becomes less reliable. On Dartmoor, many of those conditions naturally occur together. Weather changes rapidly. Fog reduces visibility. Open landscapes provide very few visual reference points. Roads twist through isolated terrain where drivers must remain constantly alert. The combination creates an environment that demands sustained concentration while simultaneously limiting the information available to the senses. Environmental psychologists refer to this as a high uncertainty environment. In such places, even ordinary events may feel extraordinary. A sudden movement in peripheral vision, a brief correction of the steering wheel, an unexpected shadow crossing the road. Each may be interpreted differently depending upon the expectations carried into the experience. This concept is known as expectation bias. Researchers have demonstrated that prior knowledge influences perception in subtle but measurable ways. When people enter a location already associated with a particular legend, they often pay closer attention to ambiguous events than they otherwise would. Importantly, expectation bias does not imply dishonesty. People genuinely experience what they report. The interpretation, however, may be shaped by context. This helps explain why similar legends appear throughout the world. In Scotland, stories speak of shape-shifting water spirits. Across parts of Scandinavia, travelers once feared supernatural beings said to mislead those crossing remote landscapes. In North America, isolated highways have developed legends of phantom hitchhikers and mysterious figures appearing beside deserted roads. Although the details differ, the underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent. Remote places inspire remarkable stories. Dartmoor possesses every characteristic capable of sustaining such traditions. Its prehistoric monuments remind visitors that people have crossed these hills for thousands of years. Its weather transforms familiar landscapes within minutes. Its silence encourages reflection, and its isolation leaves ample room for imagination. The hairy hands became more than a single story. They became a symbol, of the unknown that still exists within familiar places. Modern folklore researchers often argue that legends survive because they evolve. Each generation retells the story using contemporary language while preserving its central themes. Early accounts involved horse-drawn travel and bicycles. Later reports describe motorcycles. Modern witnesses speak of cars. The setting changes only slightly. The mystery remains remarkably consistent. There is another reason the legend continues attracting attention. Unlike fictional horror stories, it offers no clear ending. There is no identified culprit, no confirmed explanation, no final revelation waiting in forgotten archives. Instead, there is uncertainty. And uncertainty has always fascinated human beings. We naturally seek patterns. We search for causes. When complete answers remain unavailable, stories often fill the remaining space. Perhaps that is why the hairy hands continue appearing in books, documentaries, podcasts, and conversations, more than 100 years after the earliest reports. Not because science has confirmed the legend, but because science has not been able to investigate experiences that exist primarily within personal testimony. That distinction leaves room for discussion without abandoning critical thinking. Today, thousands of visitors drive across Dartmoor every year without incident. Many know nothing about the legend until after they leave. Others deliberately travel the B3212, hoping to experience the atmosphere for themselves. Most encounter only breathtaking scenery, ancient stone towers, grazing ponies, and one of Britain's most remarkable national parks. Yet when evening mist begins drifting across the moor and the road disappears into the fading light, it becomes easy to understand why stories like these have endured. The landscape itself seems designed for mystery. Whether the hairy hands are best understood as folklore, psychology, cultural memory, or something that witnesses sincerely believed they encountered, one conclusion remains beyond dispute. The legend has become part of Dartmoor's history. It reminds us that some mysteries are valuable not because they are solved, but because they encourage us to ask better questions. Questions about memory, about perception, about storytelling, about the relationship between people and the landscapes they inhabit. Perhaps the greatest mystery was never whether giant hands reached from the darkness. Perhaps it is why the same lonely road, generation after generation, continues inspiring ordinary people to tell extraordinary stories. And as long as Dartmoor's winds continue sweeping across its ancient hills, those stories are unlikely to disappear.